Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my reaction to the price reveals for FPL and day one of the price reveals, where we actually got 20 prices revealed from different players. And then we also had 4 players revealed for 3 teams within the promoted teams in terms of Luton, Sheffield United, and Burnley. And then 3 other teams in the Premier League within Liverpool, Fulham, and also Nottingham Forest. As far as the midfielders, if we just quickly start with there, I have omitted some players. So you see, for example, that Brennan Johnson or some of the Burnley midfielders aren't actually showcased here. The reality is I really just simply think that a lot of them are avoids. Gibbs White is someone that I have featured here as a Nottingham Forest player. The reason why I featured Gibbs White is simply because he's the penalty taker for Nottingham Forest, but I don't really think he's a very serious shout because the run of games is still quite poor, and ultimately you just have so many well-priced players very close. I mean, look at the pricing here. At 6.5 you've got Mitoma and Eze. There's absolutely that reason to make that jump up in price and probably save 0.5 elsewhere. As far as Kluivert, for example, someone who actually has really good stats but coming from a different league, so you'll actually see within the cheat sheet here effectively that I've asterisked a few players who've played in different leagues, and I think that's very important, right? We've seen arguably what we call Bundesliga tax for a couple of players in years past. But also, I mean, simply when you're coming from the championship, you have no guarantees of whether the player will be able to be as consistent as they were in the championship, like a Mitrovic, or if they completely fall off the map, like some other players who have promoted in years past. As far as Kluivert, I just think he had very limited minutes in La Liga, and he was more of a super sub in Valencia. So I really don't think he's going to be as elite as his stats really suggest. And ultimately, you just have much better options, as I said, if you push up your price, if you go for what seems to be actually a very early 3-5-2 template. And why is that the case? To me, it actually seems like you could probably avoid Salah this season, go for a lot of these players who actually have penalties, like an Mbumo, like a Fernandes, maybe even a Son, for example, if Kane was to actually leave Spurs before the season starts. But these are the options you have. Even someone like Eze from Crystal Palace is going to be a penalty taker. And even at 6.5, you'd much rather go towards someone who doesn't have penalties, like a Mitoma, who actually has fantastic stats playing under a Brighton team that actually have a decent run of games as well to start the season. So this is simply the landscape of FPL. I really think that players like Paqueta or even, as I said, Kluivert aren't really an option. And even Andreas, for example, someone who probably could actually take away the penalties away from Mitrovic, because Mitrovic has been so shocking at penalties. If you remember, on the final day, missed another penalty versus David De Gea. So this is an option here, of course, to go with the tried and trusted options from some stronger teams. When we look at the context of last year. And the one player that I've actually put an asterisk on over their stats in terms of XG per 90 is actually going to be someone like McAllister from Liverpool. The reason why he has such good expected goals per 90 from the previous season is because he was the penalty taker of Brighton. Now, this probably is going to make someone like Pascal Gross a very good option as we look into the year ahead, but it makes McAllister so much worse, even though he's arguably joined a slightly better attacking team in Liverpool. If we look at the overall team XG of Liverpool, McAllister without penalties just isn't really a serious option in FPL, and he doesn't have enough chance creation to make up for it either. So just looking at last year, for example, the goals plus assists per 90 just isn't close. I mean, he is still a little bit short of someone like Eze or even like Mitoma. So therefore, I just don't see the value of McAllister at all. He's an avoid for me. However, we move on to now where the grass is green. Ultimately, Mitoma, as I said, is going to be a great option. But if we move on ahead, we have someone like Brian Mbumo, who he was playing in a bit more of a wing position, so I can kind of understand moving him back into the midfield, but I still think he was way too absurdly priced. Now, right now at 6.5, if we, let's say, compare this one like Ivan Toney, who was fantastic last year and probably underpriced, you're looking at an option who plays for a very good team in Brentford. Now, Brentford, of course, narrowly missed the cut for Europe, so actually they don't, or they won't, in my opinion, rotate as much as we think. And Mbumo is going to be someone who's going to be nailed. And we also will see actually a lot of minutes for him. He had a fantastic run of games when Toney was actually already suspended near the end of the season. So I can't really see how Mbumo is going to stop that, because when I was looking at my fixture difficulty ranking a few weeks back, Brentford had fantastic fixtures. So there's no reason for us to actually not go with Mbumo, and potentially we could even go a double up with Wisa if he's really cheap in the forward position. So I actually think it's very sensible to go with Brian Mbumo to actually start the season with FPL. Now, Odegaard's at 8.5, and the interesting thing, of course, is that that probably suggests that Saka and Martinelli will be very similarly priced, and I will expect that Arsenal will release their prices probably tomorrow or even early on Wednesday. And we'd probably have to make that one decision where we have to pick between the 3 midfielders. I think it's quite safe to go with Odegaard or Saka for now. Odegaard probably is going to be cheaper than Saka, so I'd probably stick with Odegaard at the time being, or a Martinelli, of course, because I'm anticipating that Martinelli will get the minutes to start. But there's going to be a genuine consideration between who to pick from this Arsenal team, just because there are so many good options at this sort of price point. And you can see that within Fernandes right below Odegaard there. I mean, Fernandes is someone who actually had a much better second half of the season, because, of course, we saw multiple times within the season where he was playing in this sort of 8 position. That wasn't actually too beneficial from an FPL point of view. And, of course, when you look at the underlying stats, Fernandes, of course, was way clear of someone like Odegaard. But actually, when it came to goal contributions and, of course, actual output, Odegaard vastly outscored everyone in the league effectively. He was the second best finisher across the entirety of the Premier League, with exception to someone like Harry Kane, who, of course, I mean, it's not comparable because he's probably going to be priced at 12.0 and he's a forward option. Whereas with Odegaard, of course, you got the benefit, of course, the clean sheets that Arsenal did and just his high quality finishing last year, which was on display. At this point, I actually could generally conceive that we could go for both Odegaard and Fernandes, particularly if we, let's say, wanted to take that budget cut away from someone like Saka, who I am anticipating still to be at around 9.0. Son also dropped in price, but I still think that Son isn't necessarily an option that we would love to start the season with. Yes, of course, it's an amazing price, and I wouldn't really fault anyone for going for Son. The big thing about Son, of course, was that he did announce very subtly that he actually had a sports hernia last year. So that was actually an injury that he was carrying all season round. Maybe that can explain how poor he was from a form point of view, because one of the big things about Son in years past, is that he's been one of the most clinical finishers in football. However, we probably know that Maddison has joined the team, so he could generally be an option that you can go with if you really wanted to back Spurs and go for a midfield option there. So maybe Maddison being a cheap option could actually make you pick him over Son. But Son, obviously, on the back half of his career, probably suggests to some people that he's not necessarily worth looking at immediately from game week 1. But of course, whenever the time comes or whenever we see Son starting to hit some serious form, I think this price is exquisite. And he could ultimately end up being another Rashford type asset from last year if we looked at a direct comparison. Salah, of course, is arguably well priced. I mean, we've seen him at 12 and 12.5 for multiple years now. I think this is a very good price, but the reason why we're looking at Salah now here and why we have effectively 6 green options in the midfield position is because we now have a little bit of diversity where you can generally say, could I actually go with a 1 million template and go with someone like Erling Haaland to start the season, maybe actually pass on someone like Salah and just go for a very, very well-rounded midfield with 5 really strong players within players like Mitoma and Mbeumo, who will have either penalties or actually play for a very, very strong team where they get really good underlying stats. And if we move on now towards the forwards in terms of the price reveals today, I'd like to actually say that Morris is a very interesting option from a budget perspective. If you look at a team like Luton, who actually have a really good start to the season from a fixtures point of view, and him actually having slightly better stats than someone like NDIA from Sheffield United, that probably suggests that you'd probably want to back that forward who's on penalties as well. So I do like the idea of going for Morris as a very cheap option if you wanted to play a 3-5-2 structure. So we can already see that a template is already starting to be formed. Ultimately, I'd always back the person with higher expected goals over the expected assists of, let's say someone like Ndiaye from Sheffield United, once again, to make that comparison. And I probably wouldn't stretch my budget so far as to go for someone like Awani ultimately, even though there's going to be an asterisk around some of the players coming from the relegated teams, or sorry, not the relegated teams, but the promoted team. As far as Darwin, Mitrovic, and Watkins, I put them preliminarily as a differential pick, so actually a third tier pick. And simply it's because I think Nkunku just has crazy value. Now, I actually started this video talking a little bit about why I put the asterisks here and, of course, the famous Bundesliga tax. And very well, Nkunku could be that person who actually suffers from this. But for me, Chelsea actually have one of the best fixture runs to start the season. And that's actually even with my sort of eye test, expecting for Chelsea to be quite poor. Just given the fact that there's so much to change radically. You only have one preseason where Poch has just actually, I think, signed up for his first day at work really at Chelsea. And there's going to be a lot of changes that he needs to make before we actually see Chelsea actually find some serious form. But because Chelsea actually have such a good run of fixtures after that Liverpool game, and I think Nkunku will actually be a nailed starter, I just think that his numbers are undeniable. Very, very good expected assists per 90, probably second best out of this lot here. Much better minutes than I'm expecting than someone like Darwin. And that's the issue with Darwin ultimately. If Darwin was someone that I was absolutely sure would have guaranteed minutes, then I'd probably actually rate him as a second tier or even an option matching Nkunku. because Liverpool, of course, are a team that we know will be incredibly fearsome. But another thing in my head is also thinking about whether I want to go with Salah, whether I want to go with Trent, and I'd probably prefer those two options over Darwin for now. And I have the flexibility, of course, to go with someone like Nkunku to maybe go for a punt with the Chelsea team that could, of course, start the season quite hot given the easy run of fixtures. And if Nkunku actually gets penalties as well, which could be quite significant because Chelsea don't really have an out-and-out penalty taker at this point in time, and with Poch coming over, you know, and you can expect some changes, of course, with the pecking order of things, then Nkunku can be an even better option because for the most part of last season, it was actually someone who just joined Liverpool in terms of Szoboszlai, who actually was taking the penalties for Leipzig. So that's going to be an interesting thing. And Nkunku's stats could arguably look even better if you factored in the penalties. Now, of course, if you put a little bit of Bundesliga tax on top of that, maybe he doesn't look as appealing as an option, but he is far and away much better in terms of Darwin and Mitrovic in terms of the goals and assists per 90, and also just generally a XGI per 90 as well. So that's why I think he is quite interesting if you actually factor in the minutes. As far as Watkins, he is someone that I still think is decently priced, but I wouldn't really think about starting the season with him. Ultimately, he is a weaker penalty taker than most, even though he is a penalty taker, which is, of course, going to be a benefit for him and Mitrovic. But ultimately, I mean, Aston Villa did end the season quite hot. They also sort of smashed Brighton, but Brighton, of course, didn't really have anything to play for in that final match day. So that is one thing that's going to be in my consideration, whether I really think about Watkins and stretching my budget there when there's actually perfectly good options at 7.5 that I would be happy with owning. And of course, with Morris being an appealing option with the Luton team that actually have a good run of games, then I can't really see the value of, let's say, spending a little bit more money on someone like Watkins. And with Haaland, we had the price reveal today, of course. The sort of Terminator of last season ended up being 14 million. I don't think this has happened for around 7 to 8 years. So this is, of course, monumental that Haaland's got in there, but I think it's more than justified. And, you know, people are going to be talking about why Haaland is so expensive. And yes, of course, he was outscored by, let's say, some of Salah's best point finishes in FPL, but you have to just contextualize it as when City actually have something to play for, and when Haaland has something to play for as well, and he's consistently playing 90 minutes, which is actually always the case, at least that we've seen so far with City, there is no reason to say that Haaland wouldn't start the season incredibly hot, just like he did in the previous year, and be on that sort of monumental sort of point scoring streak that he was last year. And I think he is well justified in that sense, where you just can't give Haaland almost like a 13.0 or even a 12.5 price, because it would almost be a little bit too weak given the sort of run of form that he can actually hit before, let's say, the title could be wrapped up for City when we get back to something like game week 34 and so on and so forth. As far as the defenders, we have Bell, who is very, very obviously going to be a gifted 4.0 nailed starting option. And it's a little bit crazy because we've been talking about how good Luton's run of games is for one of the promoted teams. And ultimately, you're just looking at a player here who's just playing consistent games. Maybe we'll actually get more price reveals, and maybe there's going to be an even crazier 4.0 defender. But as things stand, I think he's a standout option that should be nailed in our template teams. He's someone who played 43 out of 46 fixtures for Luton last season. Can't really see why he'd be taken out of the starting lineup. I've already consulted a Luton friend of mine, and ultimately I don't see him really being shifted off the team. So he's going to be someone that I think will be nailed within our template teams very, very shortly, unless, as I said, there's going to be some more crazier price reveals. As far as Aurier, Roberts, and Tete, you're looking at options here at 4.5 who I think aren't that appealing ultimately, because if you look at Fulham, yes, of course, they finished very good in terms of the league position last year, but were they appetizing from a defense point of view? Not really. And I think actually the most redeeming thing about Fulham was how great Leno was at making saves, but that also suggests that they suffered from a lot of chances. And because someone like Tete isn't going to benefit from things like save points, I don't see the value in going for him there. As far as, of course, the expected assist per 90, it's actually relatively high, but why not actually just back someone like Roberts, who has very similar stats and potentially might play in less of an aggressive style that Fulham play? Because for me, the way Fulham played last season was very, very gung-ho, where if you look at their win-loss record and their draws, very few draws, very, very high amount of wins, and also very high amount of losses, because ultimately they would play in a way where they would almost press for 30, 40 minutes and then actually take a step off and then maybe also concede quite a few goals within that time. And then actually just resume in the second half sort of press with quite a few substitutes around 65, 70 minutes. And you could see, of course, someone like Andreas Pereira always getting subbed off quite early. But that was sort of the way Fulham play. They were very, very aggressive, but they also conceded a lot. And you can see, of course, in terms of their expected goals conceded, 16th is actually very, very poor considering their league position. So it actually suggests they're a very, very poor defense compared to how good of an offense they are. So for me, Tete is not a serious option. And with the defender here from Sheffield United, Ahmed Hodzic, this is a player who actually had fantastic numbers. I mean, actually exquisite numbers from an XG per 90 point of view. I mean, someone who actually really rivals some of the best aerial threats within the league, like a Gabriel from Arsenal. 0.14, of course, with the asterisk of playing within the championship, but also really good expected assists per 90 stats. He was someone who was a set piece demon, ultimately someone who always is trying to look for great positions. And we know that Sheffield United will probably play within a very similar structure and style. So he could be an option to think about at 4.5, but I'm not necessarily super tempted in going for Sheffield United early in the season, particularly if we actually get some favorable prices from some players, like from the Chelsea team within the defensive position. So, of course, if we have less options and Bell is the only 4.0 option, then maybe at 4.5 we could be looking at someone like Anel here from Sheffield United. But for now, I don't think he's that serious enough option. But I do think I would easily class him as a second tier option because the underlying stats were so much better than some players like Robertson, Tete that we're seeing as a comparison so far. As far as Robertson, the reason why I have actually selected him as a differential, even though he actually got a pretty significant price drop for the first time in a few years, is because Robertson, of course, is someone that we don't anticipate to be starting every game for Liverpool. We saw, of course, in the previous season that he wasn't really counted on in every single game. There was quite a bit of rotation there, but also I think progressively we are going to see that Liverpool might move into something like a back three structure, which would of course mean that a new left center back would be needed in this team, and maybe we'll see Robertson's minutes continue to dwindle over time. Maybe I'm actually jumping ahead of the gun, and arguably you could say Robertson is quite easily a tier 2 asset. And of course, he still had really decent numbers, but compared to Trent, I do think that there is a justified reason for why FPL have classified Trent as an 8.0 option. And that's simply because that sort of move towards that sort of half midfield, half right back position, depending on whether he's playing on the ball or off the ball, really changed dramatically how we perceive Trent as an option. Even though Liverpool were such a poor defense last year, Trent still had a fantastic second half of the season. And we did see, of course, Liverpool improve in terms of how many clean sheets they're able to get close to the end. And generally, of course, how dominant they were and how creative Trent was within that system. His underlying numbers actually started to usurp someone like Trippier, who was fantastic last year. And of course, in my opinion, Trippier's actually gotten a more than justified price increase. I think he's actually still relatively underpriced. But considering the opening run of games that Newcastle have, I only have to be able to put Trippier as a second tier option because the fixture run is really poor for Newcastle, and probably by game weeks, let's say 4 or 5 and onwards, we would consider Trippier back into our teams. If let's say Trent isn't doing a great job for us and Liverpool start to capitulate once again. In my opinion, of course, Trippier has tremendous value. You can actually see it because of how much of a gulf there is between the XA per 90 from players like Trippier and Trent compared to even, let's say, someone who has been a world-class option for many, many years now in FPL, like a Robertson, and of course, some of the other budget options that we can see in this list in Roberts and Tete. Now, in my opinion, Liverpool probably will once again improve as a defense, so them actually being ninth in terms of expected goals conceded, something where I actually anticipate for them to improve once again. So, of course, if you anticipate Robertson to actually start the season with quite a few games and actually get a lot of minutes, then he could actually be quite a good steal, and maybe you'd even consider doubling up on Liverpool. But for now, I think simply because Liverpool aren't someone that we have complete faith in terms of how tactically they'll operate, and because Trent is the only one that I would really consider as nailed within the sort of defensive team with the inclusion of Van Dijk and of course Alisson, who really wouldn't be options if we're actually going for Trent. I would say Trent is someone who is going to be nailed in my team as things stand, unless the prices later to be revealed are much crazier. And Trippier, of course, as I said, is someone that I would definitely consider later on in the season when Newcastle's fixtures ease up a little bit. And as far as the goalkeepers, we actually haven't gotten many reveals, but we have gotten Leno, Pickford, and Sa. In my opinion, Sa is quite a clear avoid because Wolves actually have a very poor run of games. We actually covered that in my fixtures video. But the key thing here, of course, is that Sa, of course, actually still ended up as a top 5 player in terms of points last season for goalkeepers. But the context here is availability. Someone like Kepa actually started the season off quite late in terms of how many games he was able to play. We also saw Leno actually come and joined Fulham, and actually he played a little bit later into the season as well. So the only reason why Salah actually ended up being a top 5 option in terms of points wasn't really because he was a standout keeper once again like he was in the 21-22 season, but instead it was simply because he was available for all the games and also made 1 or 2 quite key penalty saves. But outside of that, it's really hard to justify actually spending 5.0 on Salah, and I think he's a very clear avoid for that reason. As far as Leno and Pickford, in my opinion, they actually have a very similar run of games, and simply because Fulham's playstyle seems to incentivize Leno getting a lot of points if he's able to get clean sheets, or even like, for example, Raya last season where he made a lot of saves, and even though he lost clean sheets, was still able to get a lot of points. I do think based on how many saves that Leno made last season, as you can see here with the saves per 90 stat, that Leno is going to be a better option than Pickford. Now, I don't think necessarily that Everton will be as bad in terms of expected goals conceded as they were previously because of the impact of, let's say, moving on from Frank Lampard and actually getting a much more competent manager in Sean Dyche. But the key thing here, of course, is that even though Fulham were terrible last season, expected goals conceded, they still were much better than Everton, who actually ended up 19th really in XGC. And I don't really see many changes in terms of this Everton team so far to justify saying that their defense will radically improve. And of course, we can say the same thing for Fulham. But as things stand, of course, in my opinion, they have very, very similar fixtures, and Leno is probably prone to making more saves. So therefore, I would go with Leno right now, who actually appeals as probably one of the better budget options as things stand. But of course, we'll have to see what happens. And I'm sure inevitably some people will be tempted by Ederson for whatever reason this season. And we'll see much more keeper diversity as things stand with FPL prices to be revealed. But that's going to be my summary of the day one prices. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead. And I'll probably also cover the prices once again and probably top the sheet off after day 2 and 3 of the price reveals are over. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in a few days.